this time, I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Gus Cicala, President and CEO of Project Assistance. Gus founded Project Assistance in 1996 to transform our clients' approach to portfolio and project management to achieve a standard of excellence and execution that consistently delivers expected project outcomes. Gus is a portfolio and project management expert. He's a published author of many popular articles and books on the subject of project management, including contributions to several editions of Macmillan's popular Q-Book series, Special Edition, using Microsoft Project. He's also the author of the project management content in the third edition of Expediting Drug and Biologics Development, and has been a presenter at several national meetings of the Drug Information Association. Gus?
Thank you, Jan. Thank you, everybody, for attending today's webinar. I'd like to start off by reviewing our agenda for today. The first thing we're going to cover is just a quick overview of the ideal portfolio and project management processes. Since we're going to be talking about project management, we're going to be talking about portfolio management, I thought it might be a good idea just to show you just some reference points that we can use, just some examples. The next thing we're going to cover is we're going to discuss an approach for driving a strategy and a tactical plan. In other words, before we talk about integrating and key integration points, how would we actually get a portfolio and project management process in place? Then the heart of the presentation today, where we talk about identifying, developing, and implementing key integration points between the portfolio management processes. A little bit at the back end about some tactics for portfolio and project management improvement. And we'll discuss next steps. And at that point, once we get beyond next steps, we'll take questions and answers. So as I mentioned, the first thing we want to cover is an ideal portfolio and project management processes. And I say an ideal, not the ideal, because there's several different ways these processes can be drawn. They sometimes look different in IT than they do in product development, than they do in maybe service management like construction management. But for example, at the highest level, we see portfolio management sitting at the top of a pyramid here, where we have a strategy and governance layer, where we do things like propose, select, measure, and respond to the entire organization's needs. So the governance process that we'll talk about later in the presentation typically would be defined as the portfolio management of the process. At the execution layer, we have in the lower right-hand corner the project management processes, the on-time, on-budget, or business controls. On the left-hand side, a general term we use, project knowledge management or life cycle management, how we deliver on spec, software development life cycle, product development life cycles, those kinds of methodologies. And so the governance process will drive the adoption of the project management process at the execution level, which again we'll talk on as we get closer to the end of today's presentation. So here's a sample portfolio management process. This example happens to come from a product development or product lifecycle example. Visually, the little bubbles, you might have seen bubble charts. We see this sort of concept of starting off with a strategy that would drive bringing together some ideas, the brainstorming, the research and development, initial proof of concepts, maybe some degrees of difficulty or cost or return on investment, represented by red, yellow, and green bubbles. And as we move to the right, we see the selection process occurring, and ultimately we see, in this case, some futuristic bicycle helmet in the delivery cycle. A sample project management process. Again, these are not the be-all and end-all or the nirvana or the only example, but this is provided as a point of reference just to show an example of what an ideal project management process might look like. We also have a little red line at the bottom showing some connection to the portfolio governance process, which again we'll get into a little bit deeper as we go through the presentation today. So we have a reference point for a sample portfolio management process. We have a reference point for a sample project management process. And then the question is, well, how do we get there? How do we get a strategy in place, and how do we get supporting plans in place in order to be able to deliver portfolio and project management processes? For those of you who might have attended previous webinars that we've delivered, this is a connection point or a common theme that you would have seen, and it's really just the concept of how do we get an assessment of where we are today, some idea of where the future is, and then some plan to close the gap between the current state to future state. And we typically represent that through primarily three bands or three columns, if you will. There's a technology band, a process band, a capabilities band. We see the concept of assessing technology, assessing process, assessing capabilities, and coming out with some kind of a capabilities or an overall assessment report. In the middle tier, we see again strategies around technology, process, and people capabilities, resulting in some kind of a strategic charter, a scoping document, if you will, a project plan, a project for making project management and portfolio management better. And at the execution level, then we see something like a technology plan, a process plan, a capability plan, ultimately the plan to close the gap between the current state and future state. So what do we mean by that? Well, conceptually, if we took something like a project management maturity model, and these words are not intended to be read on your screen. This is a sample of a model that we use to assess current state and desired and to ask you about a desired future state and what that gap might be. So an assessment of a current state, for example, might look like level 1 for knowledge management, level 2 for scope management, level 1 for time management. If we put a tactical plan in place that says, well, what's the next step in closing a gap, we might see some coding as we look at the legend to the right for a phase 1 or a priority 1 movement across the maturity scale. So a tactical plan would address these kinds of things. We see a phase 2 showing up in yellow on your screen. Again, this is conceptual. And phase 3 is showing up in even lighter green. So it's all about choosing a viable pace for evolution. What does a tactical plan look like? Conceptually, it's those dimensions of, if you look at the bottom in the yellow under phase 1, a phase 1 tactical plan would have some point where it addresses process development, technology implementation, and the improvement of people capabilities. We have a big block on top of that, which if you attended our Making It Stick seminar or webinar, we really focused on this whole idea of a change management plan. I'll touch on that a little bit just as a connection point to our last webinar. As we come down to the end, as we come down to the final key integration points we're using in our example today, we'll really be talking about the change management plan. So really, what we're talking about is what we see in the world, and what I'm sure many of you experience in your life around this idea of portfolio and project management is oftentimes project management exists in one pillar, portfolio management exists in a separate pillar, and they may not be very well integrated at all. And so what I want to just talk about briefly before we get on to our next slide is what are we really talking about today? What do we mean by identifying, developing, and implementing key integration points between portfolio and project management processes? For example, we see sometimes a well-developed project management process and maybe a not so well-developed portfolio management process that doesn't really have any real connection points. Or another example, which I'll get into specifically here, is on the reporting of status of projects. When a portfolio management or governance model selects and approves projects, there's some expectation that maybe there would be some reporting back to that level, and those connection points aren't really well defined sometimes. So what we really want to think about here is if we have portfolio management, if we have project management, how do these two things interact and live together? How do they live in the same universe or in the same organization? So some key integration points we might want to talk about. On the left-hand side, what you see is in the graphic is really a selected subset of the processes we showed in an earlier slide. So in the earlier sample slide, we had a lot of processes. What I've done really for today's presentation is I've down-selected and used some examples of some key integration points. The project management processes on the right side of the graphic are also a selected subset of the processes we showed in an earlier slide, in some cases more detailed than some of those processes we showed in an earlier slide, the ideal project management processes. So these selected processes have been chosen to illustrate some examples of how key integration points can be defined between portfolio management and project management. Central collection of project requests as an example. So if ideas are collected from project management or from portfolio management, for example, when I showed the portfolio management process, I'll just give you an example. Here at the highest level, we have these examples, and then the detailed sample was here. So between slide 15 and slide 8, we really want to talk about how do we, okay, if we have a portfolio management process, how does it acknowledge the existence of project management? How does it speak to what's happening down here at the execution level? Okay, so we're going to pick off some of the examples here that we have of collecting ideas, bringing ideas through the process, reporting on those ideas, swirling those ideas around, and ultimately activating real projects. On the right-hand side, the project management processes. So we see some needs identification, project scoping, scope adjustment, project planning and scheduling, execution and control. That ought to connect back to the basic principles and the basic processes that have been defined for the organization with project management. So let's go through the presentation and look at some of the details of how these things connect. If I take central collection and management of project requests, so in the left-hand side, in the portfolio management domain, we may have things going on like analyzing the business. And again, what I'll mention to you is these next 5 slides that I'm going to review, which are some examples of key integration points. You're going to see in every case a major portfolio management process in the top left, and then 3 samples below of sub-processes. On the right-hand side, you'll see a project management process at the top, and you'll see 3 subsets or 3 sub-processes underneath that. I mention that only because for visual purposes and for fitting on the slide, we're not going to go through all the details of the sub-processes. We're just trying to make a point here that for these portfolio and project management processes to work together, these integration points really need to be defined. And the analogy I would use there is somewhat along the lines of, if you think about program management, anybody who's familiar with program management versus project management, a program will identify the key integration points that occur between the projects which support that program. So if we take it up just to even another level, how do we define these integration points between portfolio management and project management? So let's talk about this specific example, the central collection and management of project requests. We hopefully have some sense of, well, why are we doing this? Why is there even a collection of requests? Right? What is the business about? What are the initiatives? What are the drivers that are coming up within the next portfolio selection period? Typically an annual budget cycle. So how do we analyze the business? How do we set the drivers? How do we establish the strategy? Now what you'll notice is, while we say there's a connection point between the left side and the right side, the sub-processes underneath don't necessarily connect with one another. Right? So while portfolio management is analyzing the business, setting business drivers, establishing a strategy, and obviously other things like communicating that strategy and making sure the business lines understand what that is, what we would see out in project land there are needs that are identified, there are ideas that are generated, and these things need to be submitted. So there are brainstorming that goes on. If you get a request in June saying we're doing our 2009 budget cycle, please have your ideas submitted by the 1st of July or the 1st of August, there's this concept of how do we brainstorm, how do we document, how do we submit those ideas. So there's the initial collection of project information would come from the project management world. Another example we can talk about is there's the management of business cases. So as ideas come into a portfolio, we have this concept of how we view initial requests, how business cases are developed, how they're presented. So here's another example where a proposed initiative works its way through the portfolio management process. We're again relying on a sound project management principles to support the optimal completion of a key portfolio management process. How do I get through business case management if I'm not doing what's on the right-hand side of the screen well? Right? So in other words, have we ever seen, and I asked this question rhetorically with a little bit of a chuckle, have we ever seen a situation where we develop a business case and there wasn't much planning, detailed planning or sound project management principles applied on the right-hand side? And have we seen the kind of trouble that can sometimes cause when this initiative ultimately gets approved and we have a fixed budget, a fixed schedule, a fixed specification that may or may not have had much thought from the right-hand side? So on the right-hand side, we have project scoping, right? So in the initial scoping of an idea to build a business case, if we're going to build a business case, if we look at an outline of a business case and we say, what's a business case looking for? It's going to ask questions like, how much is it going to cost? How long is it going to take? What kind of resources are going to be required? And for us to do that well, we've got to drop down into some of our basic project management principles, right? Especially the planning and organizing of a project, especially generating a charter document. So if we look at the definition and planning processes on the left-hand side within the yellow box here on slide 9, we see that connection point back to how do we support the portfolio management process. Left-hand side, portfolio management processes. We get into portfolio management steps that will lead to the comparison of competing initiatives. At some point, we're going to have a lot of ideas. We're going to have too many ideas. We're going to have more ideas than we have money. We're going to have more suggestions than we have people that can fulfill them. We're going to have more scope than we could possibly fit into the upcoming available schedule. This is going to lead to a comparison of competing initiatives. So again, it's important to continually refine and adjust the key measurements of an idea through the use of project management processes. Questions come about when we review the initial ideas, when we rate those ideas. There may be missing information. There may be new information. So it's not always the case that the people in the project management roles are best able to provide all the information that's needed for reviewing and rating. And that's another thing we need to acknowledge. So there's a key integration point here that says as we collect ideas, as we rank and rate those ideas, we need basic information from the project world. We may be identifying some plan modifications as refinement occurs. We may see some refinement of resource requirements. We may see some business requirements evolving as the business has new ideas, as new information is gotten from the marketplace. But the other thing we should acknowledge here is the key integration point we're talking about today from portfolio management is to the project management world, but really not to the other domains that exist out there. For example, if I'm rating and routing a list of ideas, I may want to know something about its market viability. I may want to know something about other key performance indicators like an internal rate of return. I may want to know something about the competition in the marketplace. Since this idea was submitted, has somebody else, a competitor, actually brought a similar product onto market? Is there pricing information we need to know about? So these are the kinds of things we might expect to collect as we have a collection of ideas in the portfolio to understand those dimensions of an idea beyond what a project management world might supply. Yeah, we want to know how much it's going to cost and how many resources and what's the schedule and those things we might expect to come out of the project world. But we also might expect, for example, a sales and marketing organization to tell us about market viability, to tell us about some basic ranking of ideas in terms of their potential sales volume in the marketplace. Some internal rate of return from the finance department. We might want to get those folks involved as well. So I just want to acknowledge that because today we're talking about what comes from project management into portfolio management. For the selection and approval process as compared to project planning and scheduling, as we begin to evaluate and align these ideas, typically we're going back to something in the portfolio management world. We're going back to things like business objectives. If we're going to select and approve ideas in a portfolio, are they supporting what the business is saying is important for the next year? As we have those thoughts, the question is, what do we need from the project management world? Right? It's at this point in the process that any lack of integration of project management will be significantly highlighted. For example, if project management didn't develop the inputs to the business case, we might hear for the first time that a detailed project plan to execute this project is significantly out of line with what has been approved from a cost and schedule standpoint. Okay, so for example, as we get down the left-hand column, we see approval of funding. Right, so we evaluate the idea, we prioritize, we select, we eliminate. So we keep some, we throw some away, and ultimately we say your project's been approved. What happens? Go. So in a world where portfolio and project management are not well integrated, we sometimes, for the first time, really see project management being asked to develop a detailed plan. Hopefully, it's a refinement of a plan that has come out of that environment or out of that domain already. But if not, this is where we can see the disconnect of, well, we figured 6 months and $500,000, but as we now go out and do detailed project planning and scheduling, as we start identifying the real resource and refining those resource needs, as we start thinking about capturing a baseline for evaluation of variances, we say, folks, we have a problem. This is the first time we've taken a formal baseline, and we just got approval for a 6-month, $500,000 project, and when we do the detailed work breakdown structure, alignment of resources, and look to say, can we meet that baseline of $500,000 in 6 months, we've got an alignment issue. Okay, so hopefully, while this is if we go through the process, the fourth example of the integration points, right? We had this integration point between request management and then identification of the and submitting of project needs. We have the business case versus the scoping. We have the initial rating and review versus scope adjustment. And now we have real world and portfolio can't avoid meeting real world of project management. The portfolio world is not going to execute the project. So we have the reality of this being one of the most, I would say, probably well-known and necessary integration points between these two domains. The next one I'd like to talk about, and the final example we use from an integration point standpoint today, is how we, once projects are in flight, or as an analogy I use with airports, once the flights have taken off and they're heading to their destination, how does air traffic control stay in touch with the pilots, if you will? Okay, so we have this concept that on the left-hand side, from a portfolio management standpoint, at the highest level, there's this question of how do I measure and respond, right? So if we look at the overall integration point that we used in the very beginning here, this idea that at the portfolio management level we have propose, select, measure, and respond. So a lot of what we've talked about up to this point is really the proposal and selection process. Now we see this unavoidable measure and respond. If the projects are gone, if they've left the gate, if they're happening, it's fundamental to this integration point is fundamental to the ability of the portfolio governance team to accurately assess the health of active projects. Again, does that always happen? Right? Do we always see a case where the actuals in the first box you see under execution and control from the project management domain, do we always see it be the case that the actuals in the projects are in fact what's reported to the portfolio? No, not necessarily. The more siloed our organizations are, the more separated the portfolio governance layer is from the actual execution layer, the more translation we see, the more sometimes even separation of systems. If you think about some of the examples that are out there in the marketplace, some of the real technologies that exist today, have we seen a plan view environment at the execution level that feeds to a project server environment at the portfolio governance level? Yes. Have we seen the opposite, where a plan view environment exists at the review, at the dashboard layer, collecting key performance information that doesn't connect to the Microsoft project schedule information on the desktop? Yes, we've seen those things. Right. So it's really a question of, okay, yeah, we acknowledge there's an integration point that's necessary, but does that integration point really exist? What's the strategy for really creating that glue, that little blue arrow that's at the top of slide 20 here? How do we make sure that happens? So that if we're tracking actuals, we're analyzing our variances, we're reporting status, that's not just staying in the project management domain, but in fact it's coming back to a review and audit process at the portfolio level, a report and evaluation process, an escalation and response process. At the analyzed variance level, of project management, it's perfectly normal and natural for a project manager to be stuck in denial when we see a big gap. You go, maybe we can make it up at the end. Maybe we can eliminate testing, God forbid, at the end of the project. Or we can, the things we see get cut at the end of a project. Training materials not being well defined, users not being well trained, testing and integration not being well done. Those kinds of things can really, be the result of us being stuck in denial when variances occur. Being stuck in denial that we need another month, we need another $100,000 to get this project done. So it's really at that connection point, at the escalate and respond connection point, that we can begin to see the prospect of, wait a second, project manager, maybe something different needs to happen here. Maybe we need to get out of stuck in denial, and we need to think about, is this project really viable? If it is viable, do we need to go get some more funding? Do we need to go talk to the business and let folks know that this thing is going to take a little bit longer, or we need some additional funding? Do we need to, if we're in a construction management world, do we need to acknowledge that there are more rocks in the way of the foundation and the excavation is going to take longer? If we're in the pharmaceutical development world, do we need to acknowledge that patient registration isn't occurring at the rate that we hoped it would? That if we expected first patient in and last patient out to happen in 6 months, and we don't even have half the registrations that we need, and we're at 6 months, at what point do we really go back to the portfolio governance world and get aligned and get realigned? Okay, so this is an example I want to stay on for a minute because, as we've talked about these integration points, the initial planning integration points are very key. But as we get into actually starting the project, as we did on slide 19, and think about staying connected to the portfolio world, and then as we actually go through and run those projects, the question I often ask to a live audience, if we had a live audience today, is how many organizations, by show of hands, can tell us that there's a formal governance process for canceling projects that are out of line with their initial funding, that are out of line with their initial business case? And oftentimes the answer is doesn't exist. If we find out the train has left the station and that the bridge is out 10 miles down the track, do we stop the train? And as all of us have seen in our careers, or many of us have seen in our careers, the train continues down the track, and we acknowledge that we're going to have some wet passengers before the day's up. So, let's think about that just for a bit longer. Some tactics. So, if we're talking about integration portfolio, if we're talking about the integration of portfolio and project management improvement, if we're talking about the improvement of project and portfolio management, what's the process for improving that world? How do we actually get a plan in place? The quote we have here, planning without action is futile. We're not talking about project planning. We're talking about planning an environment in which portfolio and project management talk to one another and successfully exist as integrated processes. So the title of the next slide here, Project Management Improvement and Adoption. Again, a little bit of a connection to the last webinar we did about how do we make it stick. But if we're talking about creating key integration points, how do we really make that happen in the real world? The change management continuum we're about to talk about is how do we turn up the heat to really drive this adoption, to really drive this integration? All right, so what would we see in the most fundamental implementation of portfolio and project management? What we see is off-the-shelf ad hoc. Right, so let's go get some portfolio and project management training. Let's go refer to a textbook. Let's go take some non-standard process. And when I say non-standard, I mean not standard for your organization. It might be a standard like PMBOK, or it might be a standard, as there are many out there, ITIL, Prince, some of the others that exist. But we're taking things off the shelf. We take technology and we take it out of the box and we give it to our project managers and say, here, use this and be good at project management. So that's kind of the first level we think about, is taking things, taking them off the shelf, putting them in place, and doing what I call, and what we referred to in the last webinar, as the memo from Bob. Right? We get a memo that says, thou shalt on Monday morning start follow these processes, using these technologies, and changing the way you behave, implementing a different culture based on a memo, based on an announcement, based on a you better do it or else. How can we really drive that further? Well, one of the things we can think about is, well, is it even tailored to my organization? If I'm delivering training, does it reflect the organization's processes? And is it aligned and deployed with the technology that we have in place? So if we're delivering training, do we do training that says when you go back to your desk Monday morning, there's an understanding of what you're being asked to do specifically in your organization? Are these integration points defined? Does the process reflect and integrate your organization-specific methodology? Is the technology aligned to the organization's level of process maturity? The other way we drive this is, well, not only do we integrate with the process, I say we, I mean your organization, integrate the process technology and people capabilities, but then think about, well, how do we really make the change start to happen? Right? How do we get some initial adoption through some mentoring and coaching? How do we really make sure behavior is changing? So we can see sometimes ad hoc coaching and mentoring. In other words, if I need help, I'll let you know. A stronger version of that, or a more rigorous requirement we see, is mandatory attendance in mentoring and coaching sessions, regularly scheduled sessions. Sometimes we say, well, we're going to give the basics in column 2, but in column 3, we're going to include a curriculum for skill improvement. So we'll give you the basics in column 2, then when it comes to greater degrees of difficulty, we'll do that in one-on-one sessions. We'll do that in reinforcement, mentoring, coaching. So again, a focus on integration of technology and process. Not here's the process, go figure out how to use it in your tools. Go figure out what tools you need to make it happen, but to standardize that. And the focus initially, oftentimes, as we move up the continuum here, there's an initial focus on helping, but not necessarily policing. Okay, we're not going out, we're not enforcing. As a police department, we're going to enforce the laws. We're not going to enforce the process. You might guess as then what the next one might be. We really start to talk about enforcement. Right, so let's start reviewing and auditing. And if we think about it, really, what we're talking about as we get to this point is a connection back to some of the previous processes we talked about, the last integration point that we mentioned. This whole idea of reporting and evaluation and escalation and response. Okay, so as we get up the continuum, we're really talking about a key integration point from today's presentation. So what are we saying? Integrates to the overarching portfolio governance process. Right? We're integrating portfolio governance with project execution. Right? As you execute your project, what are we going to do? There's an audit process that exists and functions as a key component of improving project management maturity and adoption. Right? What do we mean? Well, we're really talking about an impact, right? We're talking about effectiveness of project results. So that's one thing we're talking about. But the other thing we're talking about is it's not good enough to bring your project in on time, on budget, on spec. We're also talking about a standardization of the adoption. So, ad hoc by definition is we do things the way I want to do them, the way you want to do them, the way somebody down the hall wants to do them, the way they learned it in their last company, their last organization, the last training class they went to, what they learned in college, what a mentor taught them in some previous career. But when we talk about auditing now, we're really talking about auditing the effectiveness of project results on time, on budget, on spec, as well as the standardization of the adoption of the process. So, okay, we review and we audit. We say, okay, things aren't going well. What might happen next? Now we get into compliance management, reporting, and escalation. So if we're not following the process, what are we going to do about it? Is there a skill issue? Is there a compliance issue? So we're going to build on this adoption and review process and maybe think about evaluation. I've seen processes that work well where there's some kind of a grading system in terms of project health. We then report on that health, and depending on the health, or unfortunately sometimes lack of health of an initiative, we think about escalation. Okay, so the project health and process adoption reported to stakeholders and other relevant parts of the organization. So here we see the steering committees, we see all the things that happen at the portfolio governance level. How do we make sure that connection happens from the projects and that it happens in some kind of a standard fashion? So how do we drive adoption? Well, oftentimes standards are connected to performance planning, evaluation, and compensation plans. The next thing we see is the intervention. So if we escalate, what happens next? So we talk about specific actions that would be followed based on project health and overall standards. Some examples. A senior sponsoring executive may not be aware of a project that's in a yellow light status, for example. Let's use that as a project health indicator for whatever it happens to be, whether it's internal rate of return, whether it's market viability, competitiveness, overfunding, overschedule, unavailable resources, whatever those compliance indicators are. We've got a project that's got a problem. How are we going to go ahead and escalate and get that onto somebody's radar screen? And so we'll see this escalation process be defined. It can include escalation because we need new funding. It can include escalation because we think the project's no longer viable and should be canceled. We're not going to continue to send good money after bad. And obviously the incentive system is tied to actual performance according to compliance management standards. So we reward or we disincent project managers to follow the process, to deliver the results. At a detailed level, just to show a little bit of this back-end process, how do we drive change? And really what we're talking about again, if we go back to slide 20 and talk about, okay, there's this integration point, so we're going to review and audit, we're going to report and evaluate, we're going to escalate and respond against what's happening at the project level. What we're really talking about is having these processes defined. Right? The governance processes need to be defined. What are the inputs and outputs and the steps that are going to be followed? How often is it going to happen? Which kinds of projects need to be reviewed? Is it going to be an 8-hour project, a minor modification, a renovation of a room on a house versus the construction of a 40-story building? Is it going to be a reformulation versus a discovery of a new drug? So these attributes would drive how and when things go through the process. Governance itself, we talked about the review, audit support that we provide to the project management community, the evaluation, the reporting, the follow-up, and ultimately the continuous improvement that gets driven. Because when we talked about the sample tactical plans, we may have different degrees of rollout that we're doing here, right? We may be talking about a phase 1 rollout that's going to be followed by a phase 2 rollout. So continuous improvement would be, okay, we had a set of standards we're following for how we do processes and technologies and people capabilities for phase 1, but now we're thinking about actually implementing an improvement. We're going to roll a phase 2 out that says not only are we going to track our actuals at the project or the phase level, but now we're going to drive it down to the WBS level. Not only are we going to have project plans that include roles from a resource standpoint, but now we need to get to named resources. We're going to continue to mature and evolve our processes. We're going to put in some new reports, and therefore technology is going to take on a different look. We're going to send people to training classes on some new ideas we have about how we're going to do scope management. So it's all these things really that ultimately are going to drive continuous improvement. So that really covers the core of what we wanted to cover today. I hope you got a lot of value out of it. I want to talk about next steps because we have a little bit more content we want to cover. And one of the next steps I wanted to mention here is, if you're interested, if your organization is interested in this whole concept of how we drive strategy, how we build tactical plans, how we drive adoption, you're welcome to contact us directly. You'll see some contact information here, so we can have a more detailed briefing in terms of what's required for a successful portfolio and project management improvement in your organization. So we can come out and talk to you about a methodology that's utilized to improve the capabilities, ask a lot of questions about your current state and what your desired future state is, sort of a mini assessment, if you will, get a sense of where you are, where you're trying to get to, what kind of a roadmap you think you might want to be tackling. Some of the challenges that are out there, right? There's ill-conceived technology deployments, and it has a harmful effect on these initiatives. We spent a lot of money. The tools didn't get adopted. Gee, what are we going to do about that? There's nobody out there starting from square one that I'm aware of. So how do we jump on the bus here and midstream and figure out how to get these ill-conceived initiatives back on track? Some of the training and competency development shortcomings that have occurred. How do we fill some of those gaps? What's the right methodology? What's the right guidance to put in place to standardize the processes? So you'll see that our moderator today, I have Jan's contact information here. Also, I wanted to suggest that you mark your date for the next webinar scheduled for September 18th. And what we're going to talk about in the next one is building a strategy for integrating project and program management and knowledge management. So if we look back on slide 7, what we had here, this whole idea of how we integrate these 3 blocks is really what our next webinar is going to be about. Just a moment on project assistance. How do we do this? How do we help you? Our value prop, our mission to the organization, to your organization, we, for a living, transform our clients' approach to portfolio and project management. So what does that mean? There's a standard of excellence out there, execution that folks are looking for. How do we deliver projects on time and on budget? How do we consistently deliver those outcomes? And oh, by the way, we know it's hard. We know it's risky. We know it costs a lot of money. We know we need a return on investment. We need to do it fast. We need to drive organizational change. So what we do for a living is acknowledge that we got to get to that improvement standard by getting there in a way that creates a continued mood towards investment in portfolio and project management, to show small victories that lead towards the ultimate trek that we're on, which for a lot of organizations is multiple quarters and most likely multiple years. Okay, we have 5 practices. The one we're talking about today is the blue one, portfolio and project management. We also do collaboration services, mostly around SharePoint. We have an education competency practice. We have a portfolio and project staffing practice. So if you're looking for folks to help staff your projects, we can help there, as well as application and customization for development. At this point, I would invite the folks on the phone to use your question and answer console. So you may recall at the beginning of our presentation, there was a little bit of instruction on how to use your console. Okay, so if you want to submit a question, you can go to the question and answer console. I'll give a minute for folks that might have some questions. I'm going to turn, am I turning this over to Jan? Yes, I'm getting a nod on the head, yes. I'm going to turn this over to Jan, and I'm going to stay on the line, and I'll be available to answer your questions.
Thanks, Gus. We've already received a few questions, so I'm going to get started with one of the first. On slide 15, the last key integration point is measure and respond. Doesn't that portfolio process really represent multiple integration points?
Okay, I'm going to just look at that again. The last key integration point, slide 15. Yeah, the measure and respond and execution and control. Doesn't that portfolio process really represent multiple integration points? Oh, yes, yes. The examples we have here, yeah, probably measure and respond, in fact, are different major process groups. The slide we had, slide 23, when we talk about this governance process, that's really, it's a lot about response there. There's not a lot about measurement. In other words, if we look at, I'm going to go, I think it's the slide 18, or is it 19? On the right-hand side, we have tracking actuals, analyzing variances, reporting status. A lot of that really is about measurement, is it not? The response part, a lot of that response part is really a separate governance process. It's really where we drive the adoption. And so I would, in a perfect world, if we had 3 hours to do this webinar, I probably would separate measure into one column and respond into another. So that's what we're saying was on slide 23. Yeah, slide 23 has that detail. And back to Jan.
Gus, on slide 13, which shows a sample tactical plan, can you give an example of what a tactical plan might look like?
Yeah, I can show an example of what a tactical plan looks like, and I think I know who this question came from. Yeah, I expected that one. I can refer to a slide asking Jan to bring up the last webinar that we did. See, a sample tactical plan. Yeah. Slide 39. I have in the back of our slide deck the last webinar we did. We talked about the adoption process, and really when we talk about a tactical plan in this case, this is just a simple phase 1 tactical plan. Train project managers to use project lifecycle methodology, standard phase terminology with completion milestones for each phase. What do we mean by that? Well, we're starting to talk about creating a language. Some organizations refer to this as stage gate terminology. Some others call it phase terminology. But the understanding is, if we had a product lifecycle methodology, like for example product development, we might have one that says collect idea as a gate, build business case as a gate or a major phase. We would have build prototype or design prototype, build prototype, test prototype, commercialize prototype, scale up, product lifecycle management, sunset product, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing we have is a tool example. So that's sort of a process example. Tactical plan might address tools. So in a tool example, we might say the work breakdown structure has to have resources defined and assigned by role but not by name, and it has to be updated in the project management tool. You'd probably have a frequency in there. There has to be a risk plan identified, and in this case there has to be a regular status report which contains scheduled milestones that are current against baseline and up-to-date project summary budget. So this is we use this phase 1 tactical plan because it's a pretty meaningful starting point for an organization that doesn't have standards. I'm going to turn it back to Jan.
I have another question here. Gus, do you speak at different corporations to present this overview?
Yes, we do. The what slide is the next steps on? I'll take a guess. Yeah, this PPM improvement readiness briefing. That's an example of how we speak at corporations to present this information. But yeah, at the highest level, I mean, if we were talking about to your team about, I'll look at the first bullet, project assistance methodology that's utilized to improve PPM capability. It really is, a lot of that is really about this presentation. What we will do before we come out and talk to you, if that's what you want us to do, or if that's what you want me to do, is ask a lot of questions ahead of time. We try to tailor one-on-one visits, if you will, or one-to-many in your organization by making sure we have some understanding of what it is you're trying to accomplish. But the fast answer is yes. And I thank you for that question from Adrian.
That's all the questions we have right now, so I'm going to thank you for attending today, and we look forward to having you join us again on September 18th. Thank you.